Welcome to That Cancer Conversation, the podcast from Cancer Research UK that brings together the science and the stories behind cancer with me, Sophie Wedekind. Over the past few years, you may have heard of the term cancer vaccines, or maybe even seen a headline or two in the news. But what is a cancer vaccine, and can they really help us beat cancer? Well, in this episode, I'm exploring the world of cancer vaccines, and to start the conversation, I'm speaking to Dr. Heather Shaw, a researcher at the University College London and leading the first skin cancer vaccine trial in the UK. Heather, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Great to be here.
So I think we're all familiar with the term vaccine. So, we've learned it in biology class. We've kind of grown up with the term. But what is a vaccine?
That is a really good question in this setting, because obviously vaccines are different to different people and different disease indications. And actually, if you look for definitions of vaccine across lots of health organisations, generally a vaccine is defined as something that would prevent you getting a disease before you'd been exposed to it. Now, in the sense of prevention, that would be amazing. Cancer prevention by using a vaccine would be something we aspire to. That's mostly not what we're going to be thinking about today. And actually, these vaccines are talking about either reducing your risk of recurrence of a cancer that you've already had, or trying to make the current drugs that we have work better by stimulating your immune system in a different way.
So a cancer vaccine doesn't work the same as a traditional vaccine?
The methodology is the same, but the disease state of the person you might be giving it to will be different. So if I was going to give you a vaccine against an infectious disease, I would want to give you that vaccine before you'd ever been exposed to that infection to prevent you ever experiencing the infection. In an ideal world, we would give you a cancer vaccine before you'd ever had that cancer to prevent you getting the cancer. We don't have that technology really yet, in the sense that I can't give you a vaccine against a skin cancer and expect that will work, because we just don't have that yet. What we're giving here is a product to try and stimulate the immune system of someone who's had a cancer to stop them getting it back again. And so it's a slightly different approach. So the vaccine still wants to prevent you getting the disease, but it's getting it back, not getting it in the first place in some settings.
Okay, so because we do have HPV vaccinations.
We do.
But that is targeting the virus.
Yes, exactly. So in cervix cancer and in some head and neck cancers and other types of cancer, they're driven by exposure to an infectious agent, a virus. So HPV vaccine, as you've just commented on there, is actually a truly preventative vaccine, but it's preventing you getting the infectious disease, which then would subsequently drive the cancer, not preventing you getting the cancer per se.
Okay. And so when you're developing a cancer vaccine, how do you approach that?
It's really interesting. So we've had lots of attempts at cancer vaccines over the years. You can build vaccines to lots of different aspects of a cancer cell. So cancer cells have a kind of hair on their surface, a set of proteins that are exposed to the rest of your body that show what the cancer cell is made of. And we've tried a lot of different versions of exposing the body to the proteins that are in that hair on the cancer surface. Those are called peptide vaccines. There's been lots and lots of attempts at those because they're actually quite straightforward to make, easy to manufacture in relative terms. And quite a lot of those proteins are shared between lots of different cancer cells. And so you can have something that might work against lots of different cancers or lots of cells in the same cancer. The problem has been that they just don't work. They haven't stimulated enough of an immune response to be active. And so they've all been tried and had to go back on the shelf, unfortunately, because they're just not effective enough. So then you start to think about different strategies. How could we do it better? And then if we go back to an infectious disease, if we go back to COVID and the way that we were driven to produce a vaccine very quickly, they were looking at technologies that hadn't come forward into routine use. And so that's when we got to this topic of mRNA. And mRNA is like a messenger that codes for a protein, that codes for that hair that goes on the surface of the cancer cell. And you can use it to stimulate the immune system to understand what the assault looks like, be that an infectious disease or be that a cancer cell. And so you can look for those proteins and then make a cancer vaccine out of that in a different way, in this way that people went at COVID. So you understand what's different about the cancer. you code for that in the vaccine and you give that to the person who needs the vaccination.
So it's a really targeted approach.
Yes. And so in this sense, we take a sample of the patient's own cancer, the cancer that they've already had removed, and we look for the abnormalities between the cancer and their own body cells, because the cancer is like their own body cells, but not entirely the same, because there are changes in that cancer cell that mean it's abnormal. And we want to pick out those things that look abnormal because they can stimulate the immune system themselves. And then we look for those, we pick them out, and we make those into a string of this mRNA substance. And then your body will make that into proteins to show to your immune system. If you think about it as like having a sniffer dog as your immune system, and if you sent the sniffer dog out and just asked it to find something abnormal, you would hope it would find the cancer cells if there were any sitting there. But it's not a given because you've just asked it to hunt. And it might find something that it really likes the look of, but it's not actually the cancer cell, and it's a part of you that you didn't mean it to see. Whereas if you give it the scent that you want it to hunt for, it's going to go much more precisely towards the thing. And so if you think about the mRNA vaccine as being almost the scent for the sniffer dog, you're going to send it after what you want it to hunt.
So are you taking specific DNA, mRNA from individuals? So is it catered specifically to one person?
Yes, so the mRNA vaccine approach is one vaccine, one person. So you couldn't give the vaccine to the next person down the line who had the same type of tumour. It wouldn't work. It's been engineered to the abnormal proteins in a particular cancer for a particular person to try and prevent that coming back. It's super specialised.
And you said like a particular cancer. We have like over 200 types of cancer. Does that also mean 200 types of cancer vaccines?
So they're all built the same way,
Yeah.
but you would be tailoring it to exactly the cancer that the patient has had. And so its potential is not only in skin cancer, which is where I work, but also potentially in lung cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer, you name it down the line. As we get better at understanding what is driving the immune system to understand these cancers, you can start to pick out those proteins and code in the RNA for what you want it to hunt for.
Wow. So you have been working on a melanoma vaccine, which is skin cancer. Can you talk me through how that works?
Sure. So patient will be diagnosed with their skin cancer, usually by a dermatologist or a plastic surgeon. They have that removed. And at that point, we would usually look and see if they have any cancer distant in their body in a scan. And if that's not the case and all is well, then we're starting to think about what their risk is for the future. And can we reduce that risk? And at the moment, there are a group of patients who would be eligible for an immunotherapy drug, a couple of choices that you can use in that setting. And those types of patients could potentially be involved in the clinical trial that we ran, which included this vaccine. So there'd been some initial results from a study that was mainly run in America called the Keynote 942 study.
Nice
and
name.
I know, it's very catchy. And they looked at the immunotherapy drug, and then the immunotherapy drug plus the vaccine, the individualized neoantigen therapy. That's a bit of a tongue twister, but that's what it's been called these days, because it's not strictly a vaccine, as we talked about. It's more of an individualized therapy for that patient. So individualized, doesn't need explanation. Neoantigen are those abnormal proteins that are specific to the cancer. Therapy doesn't need explanation either, so INT. So immunotherapy for one group of patients, immunotherapy plus INT for the other group. And at about 2 years after they'd completed, the combination group who'd had the INT were doing half as much better than the ones who'd only had the immunotherapy. So it reduced their risk of recurrence by half over those who were getting the immunotherapy, which we already know reduces risk by half. So we're starting to make big decreases in risk for those patients. So it's really big change for those patients. So we've now gone into a much bigger study, and this study is called a placebo-controlled study. So that means I don't know who's getting the INT and who's getting a placebo, but everybody gets the immunotherapy. So we take those high-risk patients after their surgery, we send their tumour away. Their tumour is coded to look for those specialist proteins that stimulate the immune system. They build the vaccine, send it back, we give the immunotherapy, we add the vaccine, or placebo, depending on which group the patient is in, and now we're watching them to see what happens and to see if this INT, this vaccine, is as good as the initial study suggested.
So regardless, they are still having immunotherapy.
They're all getting the standard of care immunotherapy, so nobody's not getting what they would get in the real world, so to speak. Everybody's getting immunotherapy. But there are a group of patients who are getting the specialised therapy on top, and some will be getting placebo, and we don't know who is who.
And with cancer vaccines, I think a lot of people will read them and think, I just need a vaccine, just like we would go into a GP surgery for measles and mumps, or, whatever, the flu or something like that. Get that vaccine, maybe 3 rounds, and you think, I'm done. I don't need another one. Would that, from the sounds of it, using immunotherapy on top of it, of cancer vaccines, it doesn't sound like it's going to work that way.
No, at the moment, we are going for a group of patients who would already be having extra treatment to reduce their risk. So they've already had a cancer. We're not preventing them getting one in the first place, unfortunately, but we're trying to reduce their risk of that particular cancer coming back. And we're trying to make the drug that we already have, the immunotherapy drug, better, with something that actually looks as if it's quite tolerable, because the INT doesn't look as if it causes a lot of side effects in itself. And so that would be a really good way to make the drugs we already have better. The problem is it's quite complicated, as we've just touched on, because we have to have tumour from the patient. We have to have a sample of their own blood so we can compare their normal cells to the cancer cells. It all has to be sent away to America at the moment for that to be looked at. And then that drug has to come back again. And it's actually stored in a freezer. It's got to be kept really cold to keep it active. So I've got to find somewhere to put 9 doses of drug for each of my patients in a freezer and keep it safe, because vaccine A will only work on patient A.
That's a lot.
Exactly. And so we need to be really, really clear that, we've got a lot of logistics to keep control of that chain so that the right person gets the right vaccine in their arm at the right time. Or gets the placebo if they're in the controlled trial. But as it stands, it's not as simple as you say as walking into the GP surgery, sticking out your arm, having a vaccine, and then going off into the sunset and thinking all will be well. We are hoping to get there. We're trying to work backwards so that we can use less of the immunotherapy drug, which has more side effects, and try and rely on the vaccine a little more. But we're not quite sure how to best do that yet, and whether or not it's enough on its own, or we still will always need some of the immunotherapy to turn up the ability of the immune system to hunt.
And I think also what we've seen is, since mRNA kind of launched in and helped with the COVID, trials and vaccinations, we're seeing now suddenly cancer vaccines. This person's created cancer vaccine. This person, got ovarian vax coming through, lung cancer. Yeah. It feels like suddenly we're seeing all these headlines of these vaccines in trials. And I think everybody's wondering, well, when am I going to see it? When's it going to come?
When's it coming? Absolutely. So this really big study that we've just been recruiting into here has recruited and completed patients going into it a year early. So we're actually ahead of our schedule to try and get some answers for certainly the melanoma community, because that's obviously the vaccine that we've been using. There are other concurrent trials running from different companies, as you say, in ovary, in lung, in renal, in all sorts of other different types of cancer. They are just a little bit further behind because we kind of ran first, but there's certainly a bowel cancer vaccine that you'll have seen a lot in the press at the moment as well. And my colleagues in lung cancer are actually working on what might be a preventative vaccine for lung cancer, looking at common abnormal proteins and coding for those in a way to try and prevent people getting a lung cancer. But that's a little bit more tech, and that's only just coming forward now. There is, however, a version of this vaccine for lung cancer as well, looking at trying to reduce the risk of recurrence for a patient. So there's lots of different ways you can apply it, lots of different stages for the patient, but obviously the further in the journey we can go towards the beginning to try and prevent it, the better. So the less unwell you would ever have to be, the better. But it gets a little challenging when you're trying to pick a target. Because cancers are really unusual, they all look very different. So if I took one patient who has a melanoma and the next patient down the line who has a melanoma, the abnormal proteins in those might not be the same. And so trying to pick targets that are shared enough between one kind of cancer, never mind multiple kinds of cancer, can be really, really challenging in order to try and get a proper stimulation of the immune system that would be meaningful, but without causing problems in normal tissue.
Wow. So that's a lot to think about. And so could we say that it may not, like a cancer vaccine, may not work for every person's immune system?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some kinds of ways of stimulating the immune system that depend on how the immune system is built in an individual. Your immune system build was given to you by your parents when you were born, mine the same. Mine will be different than yours. And some of the ways that we stimulate the immune system are dependent on that individual's immune system build, how it shows proteins to the rest of its immune system. And so it gets even more complicated in some senses when you're trying to think about, can we go broader? But actually you end up closing down who you can offer it to in different ways because of the immune system is limited to certain ways of being stimulated that doesn't turn it on in a completely unregulated fashion and cause a disaster in the patient. Because if I just tell your immune system to work harder and I don't control that in any way, lots and lots of side effects are possible when you start to attack your own organs, and that's the last thing we want. And there is a degree of that inflammatory effect that we get with the immunotherapies that we've had to date. And so vaccines are trying to be cleverer than that. They're trying to focus the immune system onto the abnormal tissue and not the normal tissue by picking targets that are only present in the abnormal tissue. It gets really quite challenging, though, to try and make that applicable across a whole bunch of people, which is why this individualized therapy's got such a lot of attention, because it's so precise.
And I'm guessing it also makes it quite expensive as well.
Yes, absolutely. So when you think about the fact that only one person in the whole world could have that drug and it's completely effectively useless to everybody else in the world, and you have to send samples away to America, and then you have to have the drug come back from America, and then you have to store it all in a freezer, and they have to not lose it, and you have to make sure that the right vaccine goes into the right patient. That requires a lot of logistics, and every one of those logistical steps costs money. And if you're generating something that's very specific to a person, you're going to be paying a price for that. It's a bit like walking into somewhere that's making bespoke clothes. It's not like walking into somewhere where you can just pull something off the shelf. So it's a very different approach, and it's not something that we've had outside of maybe cellular therapy for hematologic cancers before, which is a bit more tailored and is a bit more streamlined and very much one thing for one person. And so this is doing that at a bigger scale because these cancers are more common. And so when you start to think about how many people might benefit from these things, the numbers become insane. And trying to think about how that translates into something that we can afford, but that makes an impact into patients' lives in a really good way, you have to square that circle and make that fit.
And I imagine because it's more precise, the side effects are far less worse.
Yes,
you know?
That's exactly it. So, I mean, for this particular therapy, this INT therapy, it appears that some patients get a little bit of fever and a bit of a sore arm. Might sound familiar to anybody who's ever had a vaccine in the past for anything, really. And that's about as bad as it seems to get. And so that's very tolerable compared to if you think about chemotherapy side effects or the side effects of a bone marrow transplant or something that other people may require, which are hugely invasive and very difficult. So in some senses, yes, it's very expensive and complicated, but it might be very tolerable for the patient, and you save money not having to manage all those horrid side effects for that person, and they remain much more functional in a much better state through the whole thing. And that's really important.
I can just imagine there's probably going to be a big boardroom where this is a big topic of debate on what's the cost-effective approach here to get a cancer vaccine
over the line for everybody. Exactly. Or those for whom it's relevant, because obviously this is never going to be necessarily for everybody. There will be settings where this is relevant for a group of patients, and then which vaccine in what setting for which group of people is really important. So you're not giving people things they'll never need, but you're making sure that those who might benefit do get it. And you're absolutely right. I sit in those boardrooms and they are long conversations with people saying, well, this is brilliant, but how do we make this work? How can we logistically, if you think about all the doses of drug that need to sit in a massive warehouse somewhere, doing drone delivery of vaccines to bits of the UK, you can imagine. But it's one of these things where it's probably really important that we sort this out early before the trial reads out, so that once it becomes a possibility, we can deliver it as quickly as possible.
Did the COVID vaccinations, is that kind of something that you have to refer to a lot on, like, how that process has been carried out?
Yeah, so we have had conversations with the vaccine czars, as you can imagine, because of course that was something done at scale, at a huge amount of speed as well. The problem is, of course, it's very different. Everybody got the same, or everybody got very similar vaccines. They were what we call generic vaccines. Everybody got the same thing against the same problem. Here, when we're talking about something that's so precise, trying to make sure that the right thing goes to the right person, that tracking step is almost as important as the where do I put it to keep it cold enough. So when we had to keep all the COVID vaccines cold, we bought a lot of freezers. So actually we've got quite a lot of freezer space in the UK now, which is a bonus. But the problem is it's not necessarily in the places where these cancer vaccines would be used. It's sitting in local pharmacies or in GP surgeries, or it's not all sitting in the cancer centre where I work, which is actually where these cancer vaccines are being delivered. And I don't have room for all of that extra space. So there's lots of logistics that need thought about around it, as well as the absolute science.
And it's not, getting through a pandemic. It is, cancer is a long-term problem.
Exactly, which affects a lot more people.
Yeah.
And so, it's that volume of doses of scale of people, and how do we make it... So actually melanoma is quite rare comparatively. It's 5th on the magic list of the Big 10. So it's actually quite a rare cancer. If you think about something like lung cancer or colon cancer or breast cancer, where there are far, far more individuals, that scale up is enough to melt your brain when you start to think about how you would do that.
And going back to your melanoma vaccine, so you're in a phase 3 trial. So that is one of the last phases before you start to think about, okay, how do we get this over the line into clinics? And we know it works, what do we do next? So and just to go back, you also tested it in the first UK patient.
Yeah, we did. We were really fortunate that we were first. We were first up with our first patient, and some people may have seen him all over the news with my lovely research nurse delivering the dose into his arm as the press were all standing there. It was all very exciting, and that was a really important moment for us, because obviously the earlier trial had been mainly run in the US. We hadn't had really an access to these types of drugs, and it was the first time, as you say, in a phase 3 trial that we were testing something against the accepted standard of care. So a phase 3 trial is where you're looking at something new versus what's already accepted as the standard of care, to see if the new thing is as good as or better. And so it was a huge big step for us to say, actually, we're moving forward. We're taking a step forward. We're really enthused by the phase 2 study. And now we're going to test this in a much bigger scale. So that phase 2 study was only a relatively small number of patients. This phase 3 study is nearly 1,500 patients, which doesn't sound a lot. But when you put those patients across the world and you start to think about, that's almost 10 times the number of patients that were in the original study, it's going to be a big test of the technology and a really important hallmark, a big stamp of this technology works, this can make a difference, this makes the drugs we have better.
And what kind of parameters are you kind of looking at to know if this works?
Sure. So the main output of the trial is, are the patients recurring? Are they getting their cancer back? And so that's the test of it. If we are stopping the patients getting their cancer back over time, then we call that a success, because obviously if they've had a cancer and we're trying to reduce the risk of recurrence and it doesn't come back, brilliant. And so that's the aim. And so that's the primary endpoint of the trial, is this recurrence-free survival piece of not having your cancer back over a defined period of time. The benefit of that, of course, if you don't get your cancer back, is that you'll live longer. And so that has that knock-on piece of, we hope that translates into what we call overall survival, so better lifespans for the patients who would have otherwise potentially recurred and passed away earlier than intended because we didn't have anything to turn back their risk. So that's what we're looking for, is the patients not getting their cancer back and carrying on and leaving us behind and walking out the door. And I'm one of the only sorts of people who can say in the world, as the patient walks away, I say, I hope I never see you again.
Yeah.
Because if that's what happens, that's what we want. It's gone really, really well. So if you never have to come back to my clinic, brilliant, we've won. And so that's the game plan, is to get them to a point where they can walk out of my clinic, turn around and never come back. And so that's what we're looking for, recurrence-free survival, that meaningful outcome of, I didn't get my cancer back, therefore I will live longer.
And at what point are you able to make that cutoff of like, okay, That's
so there's
when we
lots of
know.
sort of traditional points in clinical trials where people say we have this 5-year survival endpoint piece, and that's really important for the people who pay for cancer treatments because they want to see overall survival improving, which obviously patients and doctors want to see overall survival improving as well. It's not just important to the people who pay for the drugs, but they draw these lines in the sand. And so what we're looking for as we watch the results of the trial come out is we plot the people on a curve. We call curves, Kaplan-Meier curves. Very tech piece. But actually that lets us watch who's doing well and who's not within a clinical trial. And so you plot the people who've had the new drug versus the people who haven't had the new drug and see who's doing better than the other. And what tends to happen, what we hope will happen, and what we saw in the earlier version of this trial is that the patients who'd had both drugs, the INT and the immunotherapy, did better on that curve. That curve stays higher, so less relapses, while the people who'd only had the immunotherapy did okay, but less well than the people who'd had both. And so we're looking for that improvement over the current standard of care where we have fewer relapses. And if it looks as good as the original trial, then that'll be half the relapses that we got by using the immunotherapy. So that's made a big dent in those patients who would otherwise have got their cancer back.
And that would change a lot of lives.
Exactly. It's absolutely revolutionary. And so for me, sitting here looking at the data and looking at the hundreds of people in a line, that's fine. But all that matters to the person who's getting it is, do I get my cancer back or do I get away with it? Do I get to carry on? Do I have to go through something else or am I done now? And that's all that's important to them is 0 or 1, on or off, cancer back, cancer not. And so while you think about it in this sort of big population type scale, to think about, well, how many people are getting a benefit, because that's actually how the trial works, all that's important to the person in front of you is, will it work for me?
Yeah.
And the answer is, we don't know until we try. We don't have good enough science yet to be able to predict who will benefit from which drugs. We're working on that as well, but we're not there yet. So until we try, we don't know who's going to get the benefit. But if this drug looks better, in addition, then we'd want to give it to as many people as possible.
And, what's been the atmosphere like of the people who've taken part in the trial?
So it's been really interesting. So some people have very much put their head down and just carried on and gotten on with it, gone to work, done their their bits and pieces of their daily business. Other people have been really enthused and really excited by it. My patient who was in the news has actually written a whole album about it.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's completely framed a whole aspect of his life for him, and he feels it's a really positive experience of taking part in something that's potentially going to change the way we think about cancer treatment. So, I would say that all of them have taken it positively because they want to be involved in something that may be beneficial to them, but also they're very altruistic. They want to be involved in something that's going to potentially benefit the people that come after them as well. So, you get the two sides of the coin of it might be better for me, but it might also be better for the people who come after me. And that's a really, really enthusiastic environment to sit in. And it's been amazing to watch that trial recruit so quickly, to the point where, like I say, we recruited it a whole year in advance because the patient group were so enthusiastic to be included. They were queuing up at the door saying, well, can I have it? Am I eligible? Can I have this? And it was quite hard saying to people, actually, you don't fit the criteria. This is not suitable for you. This won't work for you. I mean, even if I gave it to you, it wouldn't work because it's not designed for that.
Yeah.
And so those conversations are hard because people want to try something new. They want to have access to what they consider the best technology, and that's entirely understandable. But we also have to think about what's going to work and what's going to be useful versus what's just giving something for the sake of giving it.
Yeah. And, it's that you've got that almost that hope in a vial. And when people hear vaccine, I think it's really hard not to think about how a vaccine changed the outcome of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I think there is a lot of hope attached to the term of cancer vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. And not all the vaccines that we're talking about or thinking about in that setting are these individualized, specialized vaccines. Some of them are more off the shelf. They are more accessible. And they're not maybe looking at trying to prevent cancer coming back, but they're perhaps trying to boost the efficacy of drugs that we have for patients whose cancer can't be removed, whose cancer is stage 4 or metastatic, and trying to improve the drugs that we already have and their efficacy by using a vaccine type technology to stimulate the immune system in a more accurate way or increase the stimulation of the immune system towards the cancer, rather than that random sniffer dog sense of going round and round in circles but not finding the cancer. You're trying to give it the scent, you're trying to send it in. And so there's another vaccine trial that we're involved in using DNA technology against common proteins that are found on melanoma cells to try and improve some of the immunotherapy drugs that we use in a metastatic setting when we can't just ask the surgeons to cut the cancer away. And so it's not only the very, very exciting, high-tech, individualized vaccines, but there's also these very clever vaccines in the background that are trying to be proactive for more patients in a group in a less technical way. Still super technical, but it doesn't mean I have to send bits of tumour to America to do it. I can lift a vial off a shelf. And so we're back to the hope in a vial. You can lift the vial off the shelf and you can give that to more patients. The issue with the original version of that vaccine is that it depended on how your immune system worked. So we're back to a different version of events of it's maybe not for everybody. We have a new build of that vaccine that we do think works for everybody. So the company have gone and redesigned the vaccine in order to try and make it accessible for as many people as possible. And so that evolution of technology is always on the next horizon. You know, what can we do better? How can we do it better? How can we improve efficacy for more people? So, you know, so there's not just the really super exciting mRNA type vaccines that everybody's very, heated and get all the press attention. There are other really exciting technologies in the background that are perhaps more applicable to more people in some senses. And actually, I can just lift it off the shelf.
And having that accessibility, that helps.
It's hugely important. And also it means that it costs less money.
Yeah.
And all right, I don't care how much something costs if it's going to help my patients, but somebody along the line will tell me I can't have it if it costs too much money. And so if you can bring something that's more accessible to more people, so much the better.
Yeah, exactly. We've been talking about how, it was a real buzzing atmosphere. The press were, there was so much of it. BBC, Sky News, all of that stuff. How was that for you personally as a researcher? But also, was there anything that came from that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, it was a really wild day. It was a completely wild day. I started my day on Radio 4 and finished my day on BBC News at 6. So it was
full on.
It was full on. It was a completely insane day. And then Sky News said, will you come and do something in the evening? And I said, you know what? No, I'm going to something else. Because at that point I felt there was enough. And there was enough, and everybody needed then time to digest what they'd heard. And we were on all the newspapers, all the, you scroll your phone, it was literally everywhere. It was horrifying and terrifying and brilliant all at once.
Yeah.
Like every time I turned around, I was there. It's like, didn't really mean for me to be everywhere today. And it took off in a way that I don't think we'd expected, simply because it caught the imagination, as you've been saying, Sophie. It really caught everybody's attention because it was use of something where we'd spent a lot of money. We spent a lot of money on the COVID vaccines and that process of development and getting that tech to work. And then when you get another positive asset out of that, so you're getting a bonus, really, in the way of this cancer vaccine legacy, if you like, that really caught everyone's imagination. And we got hundreds and hundreds of contacts into our press centre at the hospital that day asking, can I come? Can I be involved? And I had to, have a sort of standard response, because for some of these patients it was possibly, but you need to go and speak to your own team to see if that's suitable for you, because I don't obviously know your own medical history, and that's what's going to be really important. And for lots of patients it was really sad because it wasn't appropriate for them or not really what they were looking for, certainly not at this point, maybe in the future. And so there was lots of trying to manage expectations of everybody, not only my own patients who were all, we're everywhere, but also, everybody who then was wanting to be involved. And that's brilliant in some senses, but in another, it's almost like lifting it and taking it away again from some people, which was pretty hard. And because vaccines are not everybody's cup of tea, we actually got some really awful contact and some really difficult approaches from people who don't believe in vaccine technology or believe that it's negative and has very negative impacts. And so we had some fairly shocking email contact. And if you wanted to read the comments section of some of the newspaper sections, it was very interesting. So I had to avoid those really because some of it wasn't very nice.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you think also there is this weird phenomenon with the word vaccine that I think people really latch onto? Because you said earlier, technically what you have isn't a vaccine, but you've called it a vaccine. Is there a reason behind that?
So, interestingly, the company that's developing it don't call it a vaccine. They call it this INT because it's not technically a vaccine. And actually the negative connotations of vaccines are more in some countries than others. Countries where vaccines have made a huge positive impact in infectious diseases, for example, are much more enthusiastic about vaccines than countries who have quite a small infectious disease problem and may be worried about other issues associated with vaccines. And so this use of the term INT for the mRNA specialized vaccine is a deliberate move by the company to dissociate from some of that negative connotation in certain places. And actually to name it much more accurately, to call it truly what it is. It's not massively catchy, but INT is easy enough to say. Some of the other companies have just gone with vaccine because lots of people think vaccines are great because they're actually really positive health interventions in the vast majority of senses. Everything has side effects. It doesn't matter whether it's crossing the road or having a paracetamol, there's a possibility of a side effect. So I think we need to be sensible and accept that everything has that possibility. But actually, in general sense, for the millions of doses of vaccines per se that have been given, the number of problems is actually relatively small and the benefit has been really significant. If you think about, Victorian London and the swarms of horror that were going around with all the infectious diseases and how that's so different now. Now, yes, that's partly from clean water and living conditions, but that's also from vaccination. And so if the impact of infectious disease vaccination can be so huge, might the impact of cancer vaccination at some point be also that big?
Yeah. I mean, that is a really big thing to think about, for sure.
Exactly.
But do you find that with the more talk about cancer vaccines, that there are some people who are changing their opinion around the term vaccine?
So I think it's also really personal as to whether or not it affects you or not. So something that doesn't affect you, it's very easy to be quite opinionated about in a positive or negative sense. But actually, if that affects you or someone you love, you might think a bit differently about it, depending on how you feel about the risk-benefit. There is, I think, a shift towards acceptance in general of some of the approaches. Some of the approaches will always be more challenging because there is a very definite public opinion that's going to be hard to move in a group of people. And they're obviously entitled to an opinion. But it's that, I think the general shift is positive, particularly if something is useful and with less side effects. In general, then I think that must be a good thing. And I think that does start to shift the conversation for people.
Did you have I don't know if you can tell me this, but did you have anybody who was on the trial that wanted to take a cancer vaccine but didn't take any other vaccine?
So I did have a couple of interesting conversations with people at the beginning who were interested in principle, but actually then decided they didn't want something that wasn't proven, that was experimental. And that's not common. That's not something that's strictly to cancer vaccines. That's something that's common against all clinical trials, I think, is some people would prefer not to be in that experimental phase, but would prefer to wait for the proven output, and completely get that. I didn't come across anybody who had not had a standard vaccine against an infectious disease but wanted a cancer vaccine. But I did have some people who probably weren't as up to date with their vaccines as they would have been because they just didn't feel that was a threat to them at that point. Personal choice again, but they had decided that they wanted to be part of the vaccine trial.
So in terms of moving forward, because you've done this phase 3 clinical trial, and like you said, the logistics is just
huge. Exactly. And that's only for 1,500 people.
Well, exactly. So imagine on a grander scale,
exactly.
and you were like, it's only the 5th most common. So imagine all these other kind of vaccine trials that are taking place at this point. But what are the next steps for you guys?
So we're waiting for the readout of the study, obviously. That's going to be one of the really, really important things that we need, is to see, does this phase 3 data against the placebo-controlled standard of care look as good as that smaller initial study where there was no placebo control? It was just immunotherapy or immunotherapy plus the INT. And that's always the test of a product, is can it withstand the challenge of a scale-up into lots more people? When you're in a small study, there's always the risk that, well, those patients would just have done better anyway, that somehow or other you hadn't balanced out between the two arms of the study properly. There are computer programs that tell us we should be doing that, and we should be doing it properly, but there's always that risk in a small study that you're not getting a true picture of a bigger population. So we're going to be waiting to see what that bigger study says. It's going to take us a little while from here because that study is still having patients on treatment. They're not all completed yet, so we're going to be waiting a little while for that. But maybe over the next 18 months, 2 years, we'll have a start of a signal from that. We're hopeful it's going to look as good. Well, hopefully it might look even better. Who knows? We'll just have to wait. In the meantime, we have to be starting to think about, if we are going to bring this forward, what would the logistics look like? Who might be eligible? Does that change how we manage their surgical removal of their primary cancer? Where we put the tissue from that? Normally that would go in an NHS specialist biobank. It goes into a cupboard where all the samples are kept. Would we move it differently because we know they might be eligible for a vaccine? Would we need hub centres that control all the samples going in and out to the production facilities where the vaccines are made? Would we need to think about storage facilities for all the doses of vaccines coming back? We need to think about how we'd approach the government to pay for it. Because if we think it makes that much of a big difference, we're going to have to make a case for that and say, actually, yes, it's a lot of money, but these people are really worth the money and it makes such a big impact on them, you're going to need to pay up. And so those conversations are going to be the next big things. In the meantime, we are now thinking about, can we use this in a different way? Could we use less of the immunotherapy that has more of the side effects? Could we use it in even earlier stages of the cancer in a different way to try and prevent those even earlier stages of the melanoma coming back down the line? How much tissue do you need to make a vaccine? How small a tumour could you possibly deliver a vaccine for? When does the risk from the tumour get so small that any cancer treatment is not required on top of that? How much is enough? And so we've got all those questions to now ask. Can we push it further back? And then, of course, you get to where we started the conversation of, could we truly have a preventative vaccine? Could we find a way of finding proteins that are common in most melanomas to try and stop them happening in the first place? Because obviously that's the goal. In the meantime, while I lecture people on sun cream and hats and covering their skin and not going out between 11 and 3, which is another really good way not to get skin cancer. But, if people who there's something called atypical mole syndrome. So people who have lots and lots of unusual and abnormal moles, and they have a very high rate of converting those abnormal moles into skin cancer. They would be the sort of people who would be ideal for a preventative vaccine, because it's not from being in the sun that they've got all those abnormal moles. They have a condition. Could I stop that happening? Could we stop that happening? Those are the sorts of questions that we want to get to next. How much more can we get out of what we've just discovered? How much better can we do this? And then, if we go all the way back to the beginning and try prevent things, also we have a whole bunch of people who have gotten to a point where their cancer's already spread. Can we do things better for them? So we're back to that off-the-shelf vaccine that we started to talk about. Or is there a way to use mRNA technology in that group of patients that would be effective? Those questions are starting to be asked now.
It's almost like that iceberg kind of thing where you're just seeing the surface of what, this phase 3 trial. Yeah, and then actually you're seeing all the actual questions and logistics and strategy that are coming next, really.
And so for a patient walking through the door, all they see is the very top edge of it, but we have to make the whole, as you say, the whole iceberg work, or the whole thing capsizes and you don't get anywhere. So you have to start thinking really broadly about, where else can we put this? What else could we use it for? But also, how do we deliver if we prove that it works? How do we actually make that a reality for people in a meaningful time frame?
So to conclude, one of my last questions for you is, what do you think is the future of cancer vaccines?
That's the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? The multi-million-pound question, given where we're sitting, Sophie. So I think I really want to see the output of this current study because I think that's going to be a real big building block for us. We obviously saw some excellent data from the earlier version of the study, from the phase 2 piece, but the phase 3 is going to be the real test of can this make a big difference in a big population of people, and therefore would be something we want to take forward. Then we want to go back with the vaccines, the INTs, see if we can use them in a more restricted setting where we're not using so much of the drugs that have side effects. Could we use more of the vaccine and less of the immunotherapy drug? Or will we always need some immunotherapy? So those questions need to be answered. I'd also like to take it all the way back to a truly preventative vaccine where I could give it to patients who are at high risk of developing a melanoma and say, well, actually, that should help protect you for the future. But as we kind of covered a little bit earlier, we're not quite there yet. We need to understand better who would benefit and how to build that type of treatment. And in the meantime, you can all wear your sunscreen, wear your hats, and not go out in the midday sun, because actually that's a really good way not to get a skin cancer. But there are some families where there's a tendency to have a skin cancer, something called atypical mole syndrome, and they may be exactly the type of people who would benefit, because it's not that they've been out in the sun that they have these abnormal moles. It's because they have a condition, and they might well benefit from something that would prevent those moles evolving into a melanoma later. And then we'd also like to go down the line to patients who already have that disease that's spread and see if we can use the drugs that we have to be in a better sense to get them a better result. So there's lots of places we can go with this, but I think we need the sort of pivotal space answered first. We've launched a question. If that question comes out looking the way we think it should with a positive result, can we build on that? Can we go further? Is there more we can do?
So do you think cancer vaccines can help beat cancer?
I think on the page, yes. The science says yes, but the biology of the people is challenging. We're not machines. We don't turn off and on with a switch. We are more complicated than that. And so getting the science to translate into human beings in a meaningful way is going to be the challenge, but we're up for it.
Sounds good. Heather, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and thank you for sharing all your knowledge on cancer vaccines with me.
Thanks so much for the invite, Sophie, and thanks to Cancer Research UK.
Let us know what you'd like to hear from us in the comments below, and thanks for listening to this episode of That Cancer Conversation.